I always believed family was the one thing I could count on. It was the bond that tied us together, no matter the distance or time. I worked my entire life to give my son, Timothy, everything he could ever want. I sacrificed my dreams, my happiness, and even my health to make sure he had opportunities one never had. But when Timothy came into a fortune that changed everything, he changed too, and not in a way I ever expected. The son I had raised, the one I thought I would grow old with, suddenly vanished from my life. He found a new world, one filled with luxury, fame, and excitement. Expensive cars, mansions, vacations to places I had only dreamed of. He didn't need me anymore. I was left behind, in the same house we had once shared, surrounded by memories and the deep ache of betrayal. But here's the thing. They say time heals all wounds, but time for me became an ally. Instead of letting sorrow consume me, I found strength in the pain. I started over. I built a business with my bare hands, fueled by the lessons I had learned from the very man who had walked away. What Timothy didn't know was that the life he had chosen, the life that tore us apart, wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Behind the lavish cars and stunning homes, his world began to crumble. His fortunes, just like his relationships, began to unravel. And in that moment, when everything was falling apart for him, he came looking for me. But this time, things would be different. The tables had turned, and I was no longer the man who had been there to pick up the pieces. No, now I would be the one to show him what true success really looks like. Asterisk. This hook introduces the central emotional conflict, piques curiosity about the betrayal, and sets the stage for the transformation and turning points in the story. Bernard had always been a man of hard work, and his life had been shaped by the belief that family was worth any sacrifice. His hands, rough from years of labor, told the story of a life spent building, fixing, and providing. He had never asked for much in return, only the satisfaction of knowing that his family was taken care of. But when it came to his son, Timothy, Bernard had given everything. His youth had been spent working long hours in factories, often missing milestones in his son's life. But the sacrifices were always made with a single thought in mind, to give Timothy a better future. They had a small, modest house, a home that was more about love and less about luxury. Bernard would come home tired from his grueling job, and Timothy, as a child, would rush to him, his face lighting up at the sight of his father. Those were the moments Bernard lived for. Over the years, Timothy grew older, and his dreams started to evolve. Bernard had always hoped that Timothy would follow in his footsteps, work hard, build something meaningful, and appreciate the value of hard-earned success. But life, as Bernard knew too well, was unpredictable. The house they lived in wasn't much, but it was home. The walls were filled with the warmth of memories. Timothy's first steps, his graduation, the endless days of father-son activities that Bernard cherished deeply. They didn't have much material wealth, but they had love, and to Bernard, that was enough. He worked tirelessly to provide for his son, hoping that one day, Timothy would understand the sacrifices he made. They weren't rich, but they had each other. Or so Bernard thought. The first time Bernard noticed a change in Timothy was subtle. Timothy had always been a bright child, but as he entered his 20s, something in him shifted. He began to take more interest in material things, the things Bernard had always avoided. The fast cars, the designer clothes, the lavish lifestyle. At first, Bernard thought it was just a phase, a desire to enjoy life, perhaps. But then it started to grow, and it wasn't just a phase anymore. Timothy began to pull away from his father, focusing more on his own life and less on the life they had built together. Bernard never understood it. He had given Timothy every opportunity to succeed, worked himself to the bone so his son could have a better life than he had. Yet Timothy seemed to be more interested in chasing after a life of wealth and indulgence than the values Bernard had tried so hard to instill in him. It didn't make sense. How could a son, who had everything he needed, turn his back on the very person who had worked so hard to give him everything? It was a cold, rainy afternoon when everything changed. Bernard had come home after a long day at work, only to find Timothy sitting at the kitchen table, his face a mask of excitement and nervousness. On the table, there was a check, one that would change everything. It was from an inheritance Timothy had received, a sum of money large enough to change his life forever. And just like that, Timothy's world began to shift in a way Bernard never expected. "Dad, I'm leaving," Timothy had said, his voice uncharacteristically calm. "I've got everything I need now. I'm going to live the life I've always dreamed of. You've done enough for me. I'm moving on." Bernard felt as though the floor had been ripped out from under him. He had always imagined that the inheritance would make Timothy more responsible, more grounded, more focused on building something of his own. But instead, it seemed to have done the opposite. Timothy was leaving, not just the house, but Bernard, the man who had been his support and backbone for his entire life. It didn't seem real. His son, who had once depended on him for everything, was now walking away without a second thought. The days following Timothy's departure were the hardest Bernard had ever faced. He found himself alone in the home they had once shared, the silence almost deafening. There were no more rushed breakfasts before school, no more loud arguments about homework, no more laughter filling the rooms. Just silence. And in that silence, Bernard's heart broke. He wondered where he went wrong, what he had failed to do that led his son to abandon him so easily. But there were no answers, just questions. Despite the pain, Bernard refused to let it destroy him. He knew he couldn't change Timothy's mind, not at that moment. But he also knew he couldn't let himself be consumed by grief. There was a fire in Bernard that would not be extinguished, a fire that kept him going even when all seemed lost. He wasn't going to let this break him. He had lived his whole life for others, but now it was time to live for himself. Bernard threw himself into his work, focusing on building a small business. It wasn't easy. The first few months were a struggle, filled with setbacks and failures. But Bernard had always known how to fight through adversity. He used the pain of his son's betrayal to fuel his determination. The business slowly began to take shape. Slowly but surely, Bernard's hard work began to pay off, and he started to see results. It wasn't the wealth or luxury Timothy had sought, but it was enough for Bernard to feel proud of the life he had built. As Bernard's business grew, so did his strength. He realized something he had known all along. The true measure of success was not in the material things, but in the resilience and effort you put into building your life. And though Timothy had walked away from him, Bernard had found his own way, one that was filled with purpose and self-respect. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. But as the months passed, Bernard could sense that things weren't going well for Timothy. The life he had chosen, one of wealth and luxury, began to show its cracks. The extravagant lifestyle, the business ventures, the expensive vacations, it was all starting to unravel. And soon, Bernard would find himself face to face with the very son who had abandoned him. But this time, things would be different. The phone call came unexpectedly, and when Bernard saw Timothy's name flash across the screen, his heart skipped a beat. For months, he had lived without his son, trying to fill the empty space left behind, but there was still a part of him that held on to hope. That one day, Timothy would come back, that perhaps the distance and the time would heal the rift between them. But as he stared at the phone, Bernard hesitated. What could Timothy possibly want now? The decision to answer was not easy. There was a part of Bernard that feared what hearing his son's voice again might do to him. Would it bring back the pain, the anger, the feelings of betrayal? Would he be able to keep his composure, to stay strong? Or would he crumble, giving in to the weight of his unresolved emotions? In the end, his fingers betrayed him. He swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear, bracing for whatever would come next. "Dad!" Timothy's voice sounded strained, almost distant, as though the person on the other end of the line was a mere shadow of the son Bernard had once known. It wasn't the excited, eager voice Bernard had been used to hearing years ago. It was heavier, worn down by something unseen. "Timothy." Bernard's voice was steady, though there was a tightness in his chest. "What's going on? How are you?" There was a long pause. Bernard could hear the background noise, cars honking, people shouting, and realized Timothy was somewhere busy, perhaps on one of his vacations or in the midst of another one of his expensive business ventures. I, I need to talk to you, Dad. Can we meet? Timothy's request came with a hesitance that wasn't typical of him. There was an underlying tone of desperation, something that made Bernard pause. Meet? Where? Bernard's mind raced. Was Timothy in trouble? Was he really asking to meet after all this time? The son who had left him behind, without a second thought now, wanted to reconnect? It didn't make sense. Bernard had worked so hard to erase the hurt, to build a life for himself again. Yet now his son was pulling at the very fabric of the strength he had worked so hard to rebuild. I'll come to you. Please, Dad, just let me explain, Timothy said, his voice now tinged with something closer to shame. The request rattled Bernard. He knew Timothy's world was unraveling. He had heard things through the grapevine. There were rumors that Timothy's businesses were failing, that his lifestyle was crumbling under the weight of reckless spending and bad decisions. But hearing it from Timothy himself felt different. There was no anger in his voice anymore, no pride. Only regret, maybe even fear. Bernard didn't respond immediately. He could feel the tension in the air between them, even though they were miles apart. He had spent so many years trying to understand why Timothy had made the choices he did, try to make sense of the betrayal. And now, after all this time, he was being asked to open the door again. Timothy's voice broke the silence. I'm sorry, Dad. I know I hurt you, and I can't undo what I did, but I need your help. I don't know who else to turn to. The words hit Bernard like a punch to the gut. It wasn't that he hadn't expected this day to come. Deep down, he always knew that the lifestyle Timothy had chosen wouldn't last forever. But hearing his son admit defeat, hearing the desperation in his voice, stirred something within Bernard. A mix of old love, pain, and something else, something he hadn't quite recognized yet. Resentment. Help you? After what you did? Bernard's voice was firmer now, his anger rising with the words. You left me, Timothy. You walked away and never looked back. You got everything you wanted, everything I couldn't give you. Now you want my help? You think it's that easy? Asterisk. There was a pause, a long, uncomfortable silence that hung between them like a thick fog. Timothy didn't respond right away, and Bernard could almost hear him searching for the right words, knowing deep down that there was nothing he could say to make the situation better. There was no quick fix to the damage that had been done. Finally, Timothy spoke again, his voice softer this time. I know I can't fix the past, Dad. I don't even expect you to forgive me. But I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can change, that I'm not the person I was when I left. I've made mistakes, big ones, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix them. I just need your help to get back on my feet. Bernard felt his heart twist in his chest. Part of him wanted to say yes, to open his arms, to bring Timothy back into his life the way he once had. But another part of him was angry, resentful, and unwilling to forget the hurt of being abandoned. Timothy's words, though they held truth, didn't erase the years of pain Bernard had suffered. And this time, Bernard wasn't going to let his son take advantage of him again. I've built a life for myself now. Timothy, Bernard said slowly, choosing his words carefully. I've worked hard for everything I have. I'm not the same man who would drop everything for you, the man who would give up everything for your happiness. If you want back in my life, you have to show me that you're worthy. I'm not here to clean up your mess. Asterisk. There was another long pause. Bernard could hear the subtle shift in Timothy's breathing, the heavy realization settling in. He had no choice now. He had to face the consequences of his actions. I understand, Timothy finally said, his voice quiet but resolute. I'll prove it to you, Dad. I'll work for it. Just give me the chance. You'll have to do more than that, Timothy, Bernard replied. Prove to me that you've learned something, that you can stand on your own 2 feet without depending on me or anyone else. If you want to earn back my respect, you'll have to earn it. But I'm not going to make it easy. Asterisk. For the first time in a long while, Bernard felt a sense of control, a sense of clarity. Timothy had come to him in desperation, and Bernard knew this was his chance, not just to help his son, but to make sure he understood the value of hard work, of earning what you get. It wouldn't be a simple fix, but Bernard was willing to give Timothy one last shot. I'll give you a job in my company, Bernard said, his voice steady. But that's all. You prove yourself. You show me that you're not just looking for a way out, and maybe we can talk about rebuilding what we had. But don't expect me to just forgive you without making you earn it. Asterisk. Timothy's voice cracked, a mix of relief and gratitude filling his words. Thank you, Dad. Thank you. I won't let you down. The call ended, and Bernard sat in the silence, unsure of what the future would hold. But one thing was certain, this time, it would be different. This time, Timothy would have to prove himself, just like Bernard had done his whole life. And maybe, just maybe, they could both find redemption in the process. The days that followed the phone call were filled with tension. Bernard found himself consumed by a storm of emotions, anger, resentment, and a reluctant hope that maybe, just maybe, his son had changed. He had built a life for himself, one that was far from perfect, but gave him a sense of pride and accomplishment. He wasn't sure he could go back to the old dynamic. He didn't know if he could ever fully forgive Timothy for what he had done. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was the way Timothy had discarded him like a useless object. For years, Bernard had poured his heart and soul into providing for his son, believing that their bond was unbreakable. Yet when Timothy received his inheritance, it was as if all those years of sacrifice meant nothing. It hurt, more than Bernard cared to admit. The pain of being abandoned by the one person he had dedicated everything to was almost too much to bear. But Bernard wasn't a man who wallowed in self-pity. He had never been that way. He had worked his whole life, had faced adversity and loss, and he had always come out stronger. This situation, though painful, was no different. He would deal with it, but he would not let Timothy's actions define his worth. The question, though, was whether he could ever trust his son again. When Timothy showed up at Bernard's office for their first meeting, Bernard was struck by how different he looked. Gone were the confident, cocky airs that had once defined him. Timothy's face was drawn, his clothes, once expensive and stylish, now appeared disheveled, and there was a weariness in his eyes that Bernard hadn't seen before. He looked older than his years, like someone who had been through more than they could handle. It was clear that the life he had been living hadn't turned out to be the dream he had hoped for. Timothy walked into the small office Bernard had set up for his business, glancing around nervously, as though unsure of how to act in the very place he had once called home. His hands were trembling slightly, betraying his outwardly calm demeanor. Bernard studied him from across the desk, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the man sitting before him. "You look like you've been through hell," Bernard said bluntly, his voice tinged with skepticism. He wasn't trying to be cruel, but the years of abandonment and bitterness had hardened his words. He had no patience for pretenses anymore. Timothy swallowed hard, looking down at his hands. He was trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed to come out right. The years of living in excess, of thinking that money could solve everything, had left him hollow. Now, standing in front of the man who had given him everything, he felt small, insignificant. The reality of what he had done to his father began to sink in. "I'm not the person I was, Dad." Timothy finally spoke, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "I made mistakes, big ones. I thought I could buy my way into happiness, into a life I thought I deserved. But it's not like that, not at all. The money, it's gone. The life I built, it's crumbling. I don't have anyone left, Dad. I don't know where else to turn." Bernard sat back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch between them. He had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Timothy to admit the consequences of his choices. But hearing it from his son, hearing the vulnerability in Timothy's voice, didn't make it any easier. The wounds were still fresh, and the pain was too real. "You should have thought about that before you walked away," Bernard said, his tone cold, though there was a flicker of something softer beneath the surface. "You didn't just leave me, Timothy. You left everything we had behind. You thought you could have it all, but now look at you. You think I'm just going to forget that? I'm going to jump in and save you like I always did? That's not how this works." Timothy's face flushed with shame. He had expected his father's anger, but he hadn't anticipated the depth of the hurt that still lingered. The weight of his actions was pressing down on him harder than he had ever imagined. He had spent years justifying his decisions, telling himself he deserved the luxury, the freedom, the life of indulgence. But now, standing in front of his father, none of those justifications made sense. The life he had pursued, the one that had driven him away from Bernard, had left him with nothing. "I know I can't fix the past," Timothy said, his voice shaking slightly. "But I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm just asking for a chance. A chance to prove that I can change. A chance to show you that I'm not the same person I was before." Bernard stared at his son for a long moment, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. He had always been a man of action, a man who believed in hard work and responsibility. And in his eyes, Timothy had never understood that. He had never understood that the true value of life wasn't in the things you acquired, but in the relationships you built and the respect you earned. And now, after all this time, Bernard wasn't sure if Timothy had learned that lesson. "You want a chance, huh?" Bernard said, his voice low. "Well, you're going to have to prove it to me. I'm not some fool you can walk all over just because you need help. You'll work for me in my business. No more handouts, no more shortcuts. You'll prove that you're willing to earn your place, just like I did my entire life. I won't make it easy, Timothy, but if you're serious about changing, this is where you start." Timothy's eyes widened, a mixture of relief and anxiety flashing across his face. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but now, the reality of what he had to do hit him all at once. He wasn't going to get back into Bernard's life with empty promises. He would have to earn it every step of the way. "I'm ready," Timothy said, his voice firm with newfound determination. "I'll do whatever it takes, Dad. I won't let you down." But even as he spoke those words, deep down, Bernard wondered if his son truly understood what that meant. He wondered if Timothy was prepared to face the real consequences of his actions. Because if he wasn't, Bernard wasn't sure if their relationship would ever be repaired. The days after their meeting were filled with a palpable sense of tension. Bernard couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had given Timothy a chance, something he never thought he would do, but now he was questioning whether he had made the right choice. Every time he looked at his son, he saw the person who had abandoned him, the person who had chosen wealth over family. The wounds were still fresh, and no matter how hard he tried, Bernard couldn't erase the bitterness that lingered in his heart. Timothy, on the other hand, was determined. He worked tirelessly for Bernard, showing up early and staying late. At first, Bernard had watched him closely, scrutinizing every move. He wanted to see if Timothy was really committed or if this was just another attempt to escape the consequences of his past. But slowly something changed. Timothy began to show glimpses of the son Bernard had once known. He worked hard, learned quickly, and started to take pride in his accomplishments. There was a sincerity in his effort that had been absent during the years he had lived in luxury. For the first time in a long while, Bernard saw the potential in his son. But that didn't mean he was ready to forgive him. Not yet. The pain was still there, buried beneath the surface. One evening, after a long day of work, Bernard found Timothy sitting on the porch, staring into the distance. It was a warm evening, the kind of night where the air felt thick with memories, and Bernard couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. He stood there for a moment, watching his son, before walking over and sitting beside him. Timothy didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, as if waiting for Bernard to speak. "I see what you're doing," Bernard finally said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You're working hard, and I'll give you that. But this is just the beginning. You can't undo what you've done with a few weeks of hard work. It takes more than that. It takes time. Trust." Timothy nodded, his gaze never leaving the horizon. It was as if he were searching for something in the distance, something that would help him make sense of the wreckage he had created. He had lived in a world of instant gratification for so long. Money, fame, luxury, that he had never learned the true value of time, of relationships, of earning respect. He had always thought that success could be bought, but now he was beginning to understand that there were no shortcuts in life, not for the things that truly mattered. "I know I can't change the past," Timothy said quietly, "but I've learned that the things I thought I wanted, they don't mean anything if you don't have the people you love beside you. I've spent so many years chasing something I thought would make me happy, but it just left me empty. I lost myself in the process, Dad, and I don't want to lose you too." Bernard listened, his heart heavy with the weight of Timothy's words. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel something other than anger. There was pain, yes, but there was also the faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Timothy was on the path to understanding. Maybe he wasn't beyond redemption, after all. But even as hope began to bloom, Bernard knew that trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. He had given Timothy a chance, but there were still so many questions, so many doubts. The past could never be erased, and Bernard wasn't sure if he could ever fully forgive his son. The damage had been done, and it wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the years of neglect, of feeling unimportant, of being left behind in favor of a life of luxury. Could he ever truly forget that? As the days passed, Bernard watched Timothy closely, noticing the subtle changes in his son. He was more thoughtful now, more respectful. And while Bernard wasn't ready to open his heart completely, he couldn't deny that he saw progress. Timothy was working hard, learning humility, and showing that he had the strength to rebuild. But was it enough? Was it enough to heal the wounds of betrayal? One afternoon, as Bernard and Timothy were working together in the small office, Bernard paused, his eyes lingering on his son as he typed something into the computer. It was a simple task, something Bernard had done countless times before, but today it felt different. For the first time in a long while, Bernard felt the weight of the past lifting ever so slightly. He could still see the boy who had once depended on him, the boy who had made mistakes and hurt him deeply, but he also saw the man who was trying to make things right. The conflict inside Bernard was overwhelming. He wanted to forgive, but the scar left by Timothy's betrayal was still too fresh. It felt like trying to stitch a wound that hadn't fully healed yet. "You're doing well," Bernard said, breaking the silence. "But it's not enough yet. You need to prove that you can do more than just work hard. You need to prove that you can be there for me, just like I was there for you. It's not about the work. It's about who you've become, and you're not there yet." Timothy looked up, his eyes filled with understanding. There was no anger in his gaze, only acceptance. He knew his father was right. He had a long way to go, but he was willing to put in the effort. He had to prove that he wasn't the person he once was, that he had learned from his mistakes, and that he was worthy of Bernard's trust. "I understand, Dad," Timothy said quietly. "I know I have a long road ahead of me, but I'm ready to take it. I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I just want a chance to show you that I could be the person you raised me to be." Bernard nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of those words. He didn't know if Timothy could ever fully redeem himself, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to make it easy. He wasn't going to forgive quickly. But maybe, just maybe, if his son kept fighting for redemption, Bernard would learn to trust him again. And that, for now, was the only hope they had. It had been weeks since Bernard first agreed to give Timothy a chance to prove himself. Every day, Timothy showed up early and worked late, putting in the hours without complaint. He learned quickly, took on more responsibilities, and for the first time, Bernard saw the work ethic he had once hoped for in his son. Yet despite Timothy's efforts, the tension between them never seemed to fully dissipate. There were moments when Bernard felt a flicker of hope, moments when he thought that maybe, just maybe, there could be a path forward for them. But just as quickly, the doubts returned, the deep scars of the past that were still too raw to ignore. One afternoon, Bernard found himself standing in front of the small shop he had rented for his business. The air was warm, the sun setting in the distance, casting a soft glow over everything. He had spent the day reviewing paperwork and going over the numbers, but something had been gnawing at him all day, an uncomfortable feeling that he couldn't shake. It wasn't the work, the business was doing well. It was something else, something deeper. The truth was, Bernard didn't know if he could forgive Timothy. Not completely. Not yet. He stood there for a moment, lost in thought, before he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Timothy approaching, his face drawn and tired from the long hours of work. Timothy had been with him every step of the way, doing everything he could to help the business grow, to make things right between them. But Bernard still couldn't let go of the past, the years of pain and abandonment. "Dad, we need to talk," Timothy said, his voice softer than usual. It wasn't a request. It was a statement, one that immediately made Bernard's heart race. Something in Timothy's tone told him that this conversation was different from the others. Bernard braced himself, unsure of what to expect. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the truth would finally come to light, when everything would be revealed. Asterisk. What is it, Timothy? Bernard replied, his voice low. He didn't want to hear excuses, didn't want to hear more apologies. He needed something more than words. He needed to know that Timothy understood the weight of what he had done. Asterisk. Timothy hesitated for a moment, his gaze dropping to the ground before meeting his father's eyes again. There was a deep sorrow in his expression, a sincerity that Bernard hadn't seen before. It was as though Timothy was finally confronting the full weight of his actions, the betrayal, the abandonment, the years lost between them. I need to tell you something, Dad, Timothy said quietly. Something I've been keeping from you. The words hit Bernard like a shockwave. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process what Timothy was saying. For a moment, Bernard was frozen. He had no idea what his son was about to reveal, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. What is it? Bernard asked, his voice strained with curiosity and fear. He wasn't sure he was ready for this, but he knew that whatever Timothy was about to say was going to change everything. He had been waiting for the truth, had been waiting for Timothy to truly face what he had done. Asterisk. Timothy took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Bernard, and for the first time in a long while, Bernard saw the vulnerability in his son's eyes. There was no arrogance, no deflection, just raw honesty. I know I've been working hard, but it's not enough, Timothy began, his voice breaking. I've been trying to make up for what I did, but the truth is, I never understood how much I hurt you. I thought I was doing the right thing by going after money, by living the life I thought I wanted. But the reality is, I was chasing something that never brought me happiness. And I hurt you in the process. I'm not proud of that. Bernard's heart tightened in his chest, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of something deep within him, a mixture of anger, sadness, and an unexpected sense of understanding. He had always known that Timothy's life of luxury had come at a cost, but hearing his son admit it, hearing the pain in his voice, made it all the more real. I thought I could fix everything with money, Timothy continued, his voice quivering. But what I really needed to fix was myself. And I know now that I can't do that alone. I've realized that the only way I'm going to move forward is by making things right with you, Dad. I can't undo the past, but I can start building something better. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry. There it was, the truth, the moment Bernard had been waiting for. Timothy wasn't just asking for forgiveness. He was asking for a chance to rebuild their relationship. It wasn't just about the business anymore or the money or the mistakes Timothy had made. It was about something deeper, something more meaningful. Timothy was finally acknowledging the pain he had caused, and in doing so, he was offering Bernard something more valuable than anything money could buy, his genuine remorse, his desire to make amends. Bernard stood in silence, the weight of his son's words settling in his chest. He had been so focused on the betrayal, on the years of hurt, that he hadn't truly allowed himself to see how much Timothy had changed. It wasn't perfect, nothing could undo the damage done, but maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward healing. For a long moment, Bernard didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking at his son, weighing the sincerity of his words. Then, finally, he spoke. "You've made a lot of mistakes, Timothy," Bernard said slowly, his voice filled with both weariness and understanding. "But you've also shown me that you're willing to change. You've worked hard, and I can see that. But it's not just about the work. It's about the heart. And that's what you've shown me today." Timothy's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, Bernard felt a shift in his heart. He wasn't ready to forgive completely. Not yet. But in that moment, he realized that forgiveness wasn't something that had to be given all at once. It could be a process, a slow and steady journey. And maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. "I'm not ready to forget everything, Timothy," Bernard said quietly, his voice softer now. "But I'm willing to try. We can take it one step at a time." Timothy nodded, tears streaming down his face as he finally allowed himself to believe in the possibility of redemption. For the first time in a long time, there was hope between them, a fragile, tentative hope, but hope nonetheless. The next few weeks were filled with a subtle, yet undeniable shift. Bernard had agreed to take things one step at a time, and while he hadn't fully forgiven Timothy, he had allowed him back into his life in a way he hadn't before. Timothy worked harder than ever, showing up every day with renewed purpose, determined to prove that he was worthy of his father's trust. But as much as Bernard watched his son's efforts, he still couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The emotional walls he had built over the years remained strong, holding him back from fully embracing the possibility of reconciliation. It wasn't until the night of the company's biggest project launch that everything came to a head. It was a major milestone for Bernard's business, a product that could elevate them to new heights. Bernard had poured his heart and soul into this project, and the pressure was palpable. The launch was supposed to be the culmination of all their hard work, the moment that would set everything in motion. But as Bernard stood in front of the crowd, preparing to unveil the product, he realized that the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. This was more than just a business success. This was a test of everything he had worked for, of everything he had built. And it was also a test of his relationship with Timothy. Bernard's eyes scanned the crowd, the room filled with potential partners, clients, and investors. His mind was racing, and for the first time in years, he felt a twinge of doubt. What if the launch went wrong? What if this was the moment everything fell apart? But then, his gaze landed on Timothy, who was standing near the back of the room, looking more composed than he had in months. Timothy had grown so much in such a short time. His demeanor had changed, his attitude had softened, and he was beginning to take responsibility not just for the work, but for his past. Bernard couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. There was a new respect in Timothy's eyes, a respect that Bernard hadn't seen before. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bernard began, his voice steady, but his heart racing. "Thank you for joining us tonight. This is a moment we've worked hard to get to, and I'm proud of what we've accomplished. But more than that, I'm proud of the team that's helped make this vision a reality. And there's someone here tonight who has been a huge part of that. My son, Timothy." The crowd erupted into polite applause, but Bernard could see Timothy's face soften. He was taken off guard, his surprise evident. He hadn't expected Bernard to single him out. But as he stood there, in front of everyone, he realized that Bernard had just done something he hadn't done in years. He had acknowledged him, not just as a son, but as a partner, as someone who was integral to the business's success. For all the years of resentment, for all the doubts and fears, Bernard had shown Timothy that he was valued. Timothy's eyes locked with his father's, and for a brief moment, Bernard saw something in his son's expression that he hadn't seen in a long time. Gratitude, humility, and perhaps a glimmer of the forgiveness they both needed. But that moment was quickly interrupted when something unexpected happened. Timothy immediately walked over to the projector, his hands steady despite the pressure. Bernard watched as his son clicked through the slides, projections, market analysis, and financial estimates that were meticulously prepared. Timothy spoke as he navigated the slides, his voice confident but not overbearing. "This product isn't just a good idea," Timothy explained. "It's a market necessity. The trends are shifting, and we've tailored our product to meet those demands. Here are the numbers that back that up. The market's ripe for disruption, and we have a product that can deliver." As the slides flickered on the screen, Bernard could see the confidence in Timothy's delivery. This wasn't the reckless, impulsive young man who had abandoned everything in search of luxury. This was a man who had taken ownership of his mistakes, a man who was ready to make good on the promises he had made. For a moment, Bernard couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. He had been so focused on Timothy's past mistakes, so consumed by the betrayal, that he hadn't seen the transformation happening right before his eyes. His son was no longer the person who had walked away. He was standing beside him now, partnering with him, rebuilding their relationship, and fighting for the future. "This is impressive," Davidson said after a long pause, his eyes scanning the final slide. "But it's not just about numbers, is it? You got a good product, a solid business plan. But I can tell this is personal for you both. This isn't just about making money. It's about redemption. And I respect that. Bernard felt a lump form in his throat. For so long, he had carried the weight of his son's abandonment, the weight of his own doubts. He had always believed that success in business came from cold, hard facts, numbers, strategies, and results. But now, he was starting to understand something he hadn't before. Success wasn't just about the money. It was about the journey, the relationships built along the way, the mistakes made and the lessons learned. And maybe, just maybe, redemption wasn't something that could only be found in business. It could be found in the people who mattered most. "You've got the deal," Mr. Davidson said, breaking through Bernard's thoughts. "I'm in. But this is your shot. Don't waste it. Make it count." The room erupted into applause, but Bernard didn't hear it first. He was still processing what had just happened. For years, he had carried a burden of anger and hurt, convinced that he couldn't forgive his son. But now, standing there with Timothy, he realized that the real victory wasn't just in closing the deal. It was in the fact that they had both come so far. It was in the trust that was being rebuilt step by step. Timothy turned to Bernard, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief. For the first time in years, Bernard saw his son's face light up, not with the pride of success, but with the warmth of a man who knew he had earned something deeper than money. He had earned his father's respect. "We did it," Timothy said, his voice shaky with emotion. "We really did it." Bernard nodded, his throat tight. He wasn't ready to say the words. He wasn't ready to declare that everything was forgiven, that everything was okay. But in that moment, he realized that they had taken the first real step. They had both earned something that money could never buy: trust, respect, and the chance for a new beginning. "We did it, Timothy," Bernard said, his voice rough but steady. "And this is just the beginning." The days following the successful deal felt like a whirlwind for both Bernard and Timothy. The business began to soar, partnerships solidified, and the team's hard work was paying off. But amidst the newfound success, something far more significant had shifted between father and son. There was a new sense of camaraderie between them, one built not just on shared business goals, but on the slowly mended bonds of family. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long while, Bernard felt the weight of his past, of the years lost, begin to lift. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, moments when the ghosts of the past crept back into their interactions. Bernard would occasionally catch himself holding back, unsure whether to fully open up, still unsure of how far he was willing to let Timothy into his heart. But there were also moments when they would share a quiet dinner together, laughing over a story from the past, or when Bernard would look across the office at Timothy, working late with a quiet determination, and feel a flicker of pride. It was the small moments that made the biggest difference. Timothy taking the time to ask about Bernard's day, to really listen to his father's ideas, or the way Timothy would apologize for the smallest things, his genuine remorse showing that he wasn't the same person who had walked away so many years ago. And it wasn't just about words anymore. It was about actions. It was about trust being built day by day. One evening, after a particularly successful meeting with new investors, Bernard and Timothy sat in the small office Bernard had set up in the back of their building. The office had once felt so lonely, a symbol of Bernard's isolation, but now it felt different. It felt like a place of growth, of possibility. They had come so far together, both personally and professionally. The weight of years of tension between them had begun to feel like a distant memory, replaced by something that felt more hopeful, more real. "Dad," Timothy said quietly, looking over at Bernard with an expression that was a mix of gratitude and something deeper, regret, perhaps, for the past, and relief for the future. "I know things haven't always been easy between us, but I want you to know something. I'm not just here because of the business. I'm here because I want to make up for the time I lost, for the mistakes I made. I don't know if I can ever fully earn your forgiveness, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying." Bernard looked at his son, his heart heavy but full of something that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. Timothy's words weren't just an apology. They were a promise to work, to grow, and to be there. Bernard could feel the sincerity in his voice. And for the first time in a long time, he realized that maybe forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of the past. Maybe it was about giving the future a chance to build something new together. "You've already come a long way, Timothy," Bernard said, his voice quiet but filled with a warmth that was unfamiliar to him. "And I'm proud of you. Proud of what you've done, and proud of what you're becoming. It's not about forgetting the past. It's about learning from it and using it to build something better. I think we're both doing that in our own way." Timothy's face softened, a mixture of relief and emotion passing through his eyes. There was no instant resolution, no fairy tale ending. But there was something far more valuable: mutual understanding, the kind that comes after years of hard work, self-reflection, and vulnerability. They weren't there yet, but they were moving in the right direction. "I don't expect everything to change overnight," Timothy said, a quiet understanding in his voice. "But I do know this. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for the long haul, Dad, and I'm going to keep proving it every single day." Bernard nodded, his throat tight. He didn't have all the answers, and he certainly didn't know what the future held. But in that moment, he understood something that had eluded him for so long. Forgiveness wasn't just a one-time event, a single choice. It was a process, a journey that required time, patience, and above all, trust. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened. The business continued to thrive, but more importantly, their relationship flourished in ways Bernard hadn't imagined. They weren't just business partners. They were father and son, learning to heal, learning to trust again. There were still challenges ahead, still old habits to break, but there was also a new sense of unity between them, one that was built on respect, understanding, and the willingness to move forward together. Bernard had spent years wondering if he could ever forgive his son for abandoning him, for walking away and leaving him to pick up the pieces of his broken heart. But now, as he looked at Timothy, he realized that the real lesson wasn't about forgiveness at all. It was about growth, both his own and Timothy's, and about giving love and trust a chance, even when it felt like the hardest thing in the world to do. And so, they moved forward step by step together, no longer haunted by the ghosts of the past, but driven by the promise of a future they could build together, a future that was theirs to shape, to grow, and to make right. Have you ever faced a moment where betrayal tore apart everything you believed in? A time when someone you loved and trusted walked away, leaving you with nothing but heartache and regret? What would you do if that person came back, asking for a chance to make things right? Would you be able to forgive? Or would the pain of the past be too much to bear? I know many of you have gone through similar struggles. Maybe it's not with a child, but with a partner, a friend, or even a family member. The question of forgiveness, the weight of betrayal, it's something that we all face at different points in our lives. And sometimes it feels impossible. The wounds are too deep, the trust too broken. But as this story shows, healing is a process. It's about taking the first step toward forgiveness, even when it feels like you'll never be able to forget. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation like Bernard or Timothy's? Have you ever had to rebuild a relationship that felt like it was beyond repair? How did you handle the pain of betrayal? And most importantly, how did you find the strength to forgive, or did you? The truth is, forgiveness isn't something that happens overnight. It's not a magic fix. It's a journey, a difficult one, but one that can lead to something beautiful if we're willing to put in the work. Just like Bernard and Timothy, sometimes we have to take it one step at a time, slowly rebuilding trust, showing up for each other, and learning to heal. And through that process, we might just find that the person we once thought was lost to us is someone we can learn to love and trust again. So, if you're facing your own journey of healing, if you're trying to forgive someone who has hurt you, or if you've experienced the pain of being betrayed, I want to hear your story. What did you do when faced with that moment of reckoning? What did it take to begin the healing process? Take a moment to reflect on your own experiences with forgiveness and redemption. It's not easy, but sometimes sharing our stories helps us realize we're not alone. If you found a way to move forward, to rebuild those broken connections, your journey could help someone else who's struggling with the same thing. If this story resonated with you, If it touched your heart and made you think about your own relationships, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Maybe they're struggling with forgiveness, or maybe they've been waiting for the right moment to take the first step in rebuilding trust. Your sharing could be the catalyst they need to begin their own journey of healing. And if you're new here, or if you found something meaningful in this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Join this community where we talk about the hard things, the pain, the healing, and the lessons we all learn along the way. By subscribing, you're not just supporting this channel. You're becoming part of a community that understands that life isn't perfect, but it's the way we handle the challenges that define us. I want to thank you for being part of this conversation. Your thoughts, your experiences, your voice, it all matters. Let's continue to share, to grow, and to heal together. We all have our own stories of redemption, and together we can turn those stories into something powerful. If you're ready to take that step, if you're ready to forgive and start rebuilding, then let's do it together. Share your story below, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to hearing from you.